The bright hospital lights hurt my eyes as I slowly opened them. My stomach felt like someone had stabbed me with a knife, which I guess they had, sort of. The appendix surgery was supposed to be routine, the doctor had said. You'll be fine in a few days, he'd promised before I went under anesthesia. But as I looked around the sterile white room, something felt wrong. The chair next to my bed was empty. The small table had no flowers, no get-well cards, no sign that anyone cared I was here. I tried to remember what had happened before surgery. Mom and Dad had been there when they wheeled me into the operating room, hadn't they? I could barely recall their faces through the haze of pain medication, but I was sure they'd been there. Mom? I called out weakly, my voice barely a whisper. No answer. The room was eerily quiet except for the steady beeping of machines monitoring my heartbeat. Where was everyone? Panic started to creep into my chest as I realized I was completely alone in this scary place, recovering from surgery at just 13 years old. A nurse with kind eyes and graying hair came into my room when she heard me stirring. Oh good, you're awake, she said with a gentle smile, checking the machines around my bed. How are you feeling, sweetheart? My throat was dry and scratchy, but I managed to ask the question that was burning in my mind. Where are my parents? Are they getting coffee or something? The nurse's smile faltered slightly, and she looked uncomfortable. She busied herself with adjusting my blanket, avoiding my eyes. Honey, she said softly, your parents left several hours ago. Right after the doctor told them your surgery went well. The words hit me like a punch to the stomach, and it already hurt enough down there. Left? I repeated, hoping I'd misunderstood. But I just woke up. Don't they want to make sure I'm okay? The nurse's expression grew even more sympathetic. I'm sorry, dear. They said they had somewhere else they needed to be. Somewhere else. More important than their daughter recovering from surgery. The beeping of my heart monitor got a little faster as the reality sank in. They'd abandoned me here, alone and scared, because something else mattered more than I did. As my head cleared from the anesthesia, I looked around for the small overnight bag Mom had packed for me. It had my favorite pajamas, some books, and the stuffed elephant I'd had since I was little, childish maybe, but I'd wanted something comforting for the scary hospital stay. The bag wasn't anywhere in sight. I pressed the call button, and the same kind nurse returned. My bag, I said weakly. Did my parents take my clothes home? She checked the small closet and looked under the bed, then shook her head sadly. It looks like they took everything with them, honey. Even my comfort items. They'd stripped the room of any trace that they'd ever been here, ever cared about me. I was left with nothing but a thin hospital gown and the growing realization that I truly meant nothing to them. Other kids in the hospital had rooms filled with balloons, flowers, and family members taking turns staying overnight. I had 4 blank walls and the distant sound of other people's visitors laughing and talking. The loneliness felt heavier than the pain in my abdomen. How do you explain to a 13-year-old why her parents left her alone in the most vulnerable moment of her young life? The nurse let me use the phone at the nurse's station, wheeling my 4-pole alongside me as I shuffled slowly down the hall. My fingers shook as I dialed our home number, hoping there was some explanation, some emergency that had pulled them away. Maybe Grandma was sick, or there'd been an accident. Anything that would make sense of why they'd leave me alone after surgery. Mom answered on the 3rd ring, her voice cheerful and normal. Hello? Mom, it's me, I said, my voice cracking. I woke up and you weren't here. When are you coming back? There was a pause, then an annoyed sigh. Oh, for heaven's sake. You're fine, aren't you? The doctor said the surgery went perfectly. But I'm scared, I whispered, aware that the nurses could hear me. I don't understand why you left. We had more important things to do than sit around watching you sleep, she said impatiently. You're not a baby anymore. Stop being so dramatic. The words felt like another surgical cut, deeper than the one in my stomach. More important things. At 13, recovering from surgery, I wasn't important enough for my own parents to stay with me. Through the phone, I could hear voices in the background, excited, happy voices. There was cheering and someone calling out, "Goal." My heart sank as I realized what the more important thing was. "Are you at Smith's soccer game?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. Smith was my 15-year-old brother, the golden child who could do no wrong in our parents' eyes. "Of course we are," Mom said, as if it was the most obvious thing in the world. "He's been working toward this championship all season. We couldn't miss it." I pressed the phone closer to my ear, listening to the sounds of a normal family enjoying a Saturday afternoon together. Parents cheering for their son, buying him snacks, celebrating his achievements. Meanwhile, their daughter was alone in a hospital bed, wondering why she wasn't worth staying for. "When will you come get me?" I asked weakly. "Tomorrow probably," Mom replied dismissively. "The doctor said you'd be fine to come home then. We'll see you later." She hung up before I could say anything else, leaving me standing there in a hospital hallway, holding a dead phone and trying not to cry in front of the nurses who were pretending not to notice my conversation. The same kind nurse who'd been taking care of me helped me shuffle back to my room. I could tell she'd overheard at least part of my phone conversation because her eyes looked sad and a little angry. "How about some ice cream?" she suggested, though it wasn't mealtime. "I think we have chocolate." She returned a few minutes later with not just ice cream, but an extra pudding cup, some crackers, and a small stuffed bear from the pediatric ward. "Sometimes," she said quietly as she arranged the treats on my bedside table, "the families we're born into aren't the families we deserve." She patted my hand gently. "But that doesn't mean there's anything wrong with you, sweetheart. Some people just don't know how to love properly." Her words were the first comfort I'd felt since waking up. This stranger, this nurse whose name I didn't even know, cared more about my well-being than my own parents did. She stayed and chatted with me for a few extra minutes, telling me about her own kids and asking about school. For those few minutes, I felt like maybe I mattered to someone after all. That night was the longest of my 13 years of life. The hospital never really gets quiet, there are always footsteps in the hallways, machines beeping, nurses talking softly at their station. But my room felt empty and cold despite the warm blankets. I stared at the ceiling tiles, counting the little holes in them over and over, trying not to think about why I wasn't worth staying for. Other kids had parents sleeping in uncomfortable chairs beside their beds, holding their hands during the scary parts, being there when they woke up from nightmares about the surgery. I had no one. The stuffed bear the nurse had given me sat on the bedside table, and I was too proud to hug it, even though I desperately wanted to. 13 felt too old for stuffed animals, but not too old to want your mom when you were scared and hurting. I kept replaying Mom's words, more important things to do. What could be more important than your own child? As the hours crawled by, I started to understand something that would change me forever. I was not a priority in my own family. I was just an inconvenience they had to deal with. The next morning, Dad showed up alone to take me home. No flowers, no "how are you feeling," no hug. He looked impatient and kept checking his watch as the nurse went over my discharge instructions. Yeah, rest and fluids," he said dismissively. "Can we hurry this up? I have a conference call at 11. I moved slowly, my incisions still tender and my legs weak from lying in bed. "Dad, can you help me?" I asked as I struggled to put on the hospital slippers they'd given me since my parents had taken my clothes. "You're fine," he said without looking up from his phone. "Just move faster. I don't have all day." The nurse shot him a disapproving look but helped me herself, her gentle hands a stark contrast to his coldness. As we walked to the car, Dad walked ahead of me, not even glancing back to see if I could keep up. I clutched my stuffed bear, the only gift I'd received during my hospital stay, and realized this was what my life was going to be like. I was on my own, even at 13, even after surgery, even when I needed them most. When we got home, I expected maybe some concern about how I was feeling, or perhaps the house set up for an easy recovery, maybe some soup ready, or my bed made comfortable. Instead, I walked into chaos. Smith was in the living room surrounded by gift bags, new soccer equipment scattered everywhere. His championship trophy sat prominently on the coffee table, catching the afternoon light. "Look what I got," he called out excitedly, holding up expensive new cleats. Mom rushed over to admire them, cooing about how he deserved every reward. I stood in the doorway, still in my hospital clothes, holding my small stuffed bear, and realized I was invisible. No one asked how I felt. No one mentioned my surgery. It was like I'd never been gone at all. "Can someone help me upstairs?" I asked quietly, my incision pulling as I tried to climb the steps. "In a minute," Mom said distractedly, too busy organizing Smith's new gear. I made it up the stairs alone, one slow step at a time, and collapsed on my bed. Through my bedroom floor, I could hear them celebrating Smith's victory, their voices full of pride and joy. The sound of a happy family, one that apparently didn't include me. Months later, my 14th birthday arrived on a Tuesday. I woke up early, hoping maybe this year would be different, maybe they'd remember without me having to remind them. I came downstairs expecting at least a happy birthday, or maybe pancakes instead of cereal. Instead, Mom was rushing around getting ready for work, and Dad was already gone. Smith was eating toast and didn't even look up when I entered the kitchen. "Morning," I said hopefully. "Morning," Mom replied absently, grabbing her coffee and car keys. No mention of what day it was. At school, a few friends wished me happy birthday, and my English teacher had remembered and brought me a small cupcake. But at home, dinner was the same as always, takeout eaten in front of the TV, everyone focused on Smith's upcoming game. I went to bed that night wondering if they even remembered I existed. But the very next week was Smith's 15th birthday, and the house transformed. Balloons filled the living room, a huge cake sat on the kitchen counter, and Mom had hired a party bus to take Smith and his friends to an arcade. The contrast was so stark it took my breath away. One child forgotten, the other celebrated like royalty. Mrs. Drake, my 8th grade English teacher, kept me after class on a Thursday afternoon in November. She'd been watching me carefully for weeks, probably noticing that I never talked about family events or brought signed permission slips back on time. "How are things at home?" she asked gently, organizing papers on her desk to make the conversation feel casual. I shrugged, trying to look normal. "Fine." But she kept looking at me with those kind, observant eyes that teachers develop after years of working with kids who are hurting. "You seem sad lately," she said softly. "Is everything okay with your family?" Something about her tone, the genuine concern in her voice, broke through all my defenses. The tears I'd been holding back for months suddenly poured out. "They left me alone at the hospital," I sobbed, the words tumbling out between gasps. "After my surgery, they just left to go to my brother's game. They forgot my birthday. They never notice me unless I'm in trouble." Mrs. Drake handed me tissues and let me cry until I couldn't cry anymore. Then she said something I'll never forget: "That's not normal, sweetie. Parents are supposed to take care of all their children equally." That night, I started writing everything down in a composition notebook I'd bought with my lunch money. October 15th, surgery day. Parents left me alone for Smith's soccer game, I wrote on the first page. November 3rd, my birthday forgotten. Smith's birthday gets party bus and 20 friends. Page after page filled with incidents I'd been telling myself were normal, were just part of having a busy family. But seeing them written down made the pattern impossible to ignore. December 2nd, parent-teacher conferences. They went to Smith's but forgot about mine. December 18th, Christmas program at school. I had a solo. They weren't there, another one of Smith's games. January 14th, I got straight A's on my report card. Smith got mostly C's but also made varsity soccer. Guess which one got celebrated? The notebook became my proof that I wasn't imagining things, wasn't being dramatic or oversensitive like they always said. I was systematically being treated as less important than my brother. Writing it down didn't make it hurt less, but it made me feel less crazy. The pattern was real, and it was wrong. High school brought new opportunities and a growing determination to create my own future. I threw myself into my studies with an intensity that surprised even me. While Smith focused on sports and social life, I spent hours in the library researching colleges and scholarship opportunities. I knew without a doubt that my parents wouldn't pay for my education. They'd made it clear in 100 small ways that I wasn't worth investing in. But maybe, if I worked hard enough, I could earn my own way out. I joined every academic club I could find, volunteered at the local animal shelter, and maintained perfect grades. My guidance counselor, Mr. Barnes, noticed my dedication and started helping me research schools known for generous merit scholarships. "You have the potential to go anywhere you want," he told me during one of our meetings. "Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." I didn't tell him that the people most likely to tell me otherwise lived in my own house. Instead, I worked harder, stayed later at school, and built a future that had nothing to do with the family that had made it clear I didn't matter to them. The dinner conversation that changed everything happened on a cold February evening during my junior year. Smith was stressing about college applications, his grades too mediocre for the schools he wanted to attend. "Don't worry, son," Dad said reassuringly. "We've been saving for your college education since you were born. Money won't be an issue." Mom nodded enthusiastically. "We have enough set aside for a good school, plus living expenses. You can focus on your sports and not worry about working during college." I looked up from my homework, which I was doing at the dinner table since my small bedroom had no desk. "What about college money for me?" I asked quietly. The silence that followed was deafening. Mom and Dad exchanged a look that spoke volumes. "Well," Dad said slowly, "we always assumed you'd figure something out. You're smart, surely you can get scholarships or something." The casual dismissal of my future felt like a physical blow. They'd been planning and saving for Smith's college education his entire life, but had never given a moment's thought to mine. In their minds, I was so unimportant that my education was just something I'd figure out on my own. I excused myself from the table and went upstairs, adding this conversation to my growing notebook of evidence that I was the disposable child. The next week, I got my first job at the local grocery store. I lied about my age slightly and convinced the manager I was responsible enough to work after school and weekends. Mom barely looked up when I told her about it. "Good," she said distractedly. "Maybe you'll learn some responsibility." She didn't ask what I planned to do with the money, didn't offer to help me open a bank account, didn't even seem curious about my sudden independence. Dad's only comment was that I'd better not let it affect my grades, since he didn't want to deal with calls from the school. They were so uninterested in my life that they didn't notice when I started coming home later, when I began having my own spending money, or when I quietly opened my own savings account. Every paycheck went straight into that account, building toward a future they weren't part of. My co-workers, mostly older teenagers and college students, treated me with more respect and kindness than my own family ever had. For the first time, I was somewhere people valued my contribution and noticed when I worked hard. It felt like a glimpse of what life could be like when I finally escaped. The scholarship acceptance letter arrived on a rainy Thursday in March of my senior year. I'd applied to dozens of programs, written countless essays, and submitted applications to schools across the country. This particular letter was from State University, offering me a full academic scholarship covering tuition, room, board, and even a small stipend for books and supplies. I read it 3 times before it sank in. I'd actually done it. I'd earned my way out entirely on my own merit. My hands shook as I held the letter, and I had to lock myself in the bathroom to cry properly. These weren't tears of sadness like I'd shed so many times before. These were tears of relief, pride, and something I'd never really felt before, hope for the future. I'd proven to myself that I was worth something, even if my family never saw it. The girl they'd left alone in the hospital at 13 had grown into someone strong enough to save herself. I folded the letter carefully and put it in my drawer with my notebook of memories. This was my ticket to freedom, earned entirely through my own hard work and determination. At dinner that night, I decided to share my good news. Smith was complaining about his college waitlist status, and Mom was reassuring him that his backup schools were perfectly fine options. "I have some news too," I said during a lull in the conversation. 3 faces turned toward me with mild curiosity, unusual in itself, since they rarely paid attention to what I had to say. I got a full scholarship to State University, I announced, trying to keep the pride out of my voice. Everything paid for, tuition, room, board, everything. I expected surprise, maybe even a little congratulations. Instead, Dad just shrugged. Good, he said simply. Now we don't have to pay for you. That was it. No pride in my achievement, no questions about what I'd studied or how I'd managed to earn such a competitive scholarship. Just relief that I wouldn't cost them anything. Mom nodded in agreement. That's smart of you to handle it yourself, she said, as if I'd had any other choice. Smith looked up briefly from his phone, said, "Cool," and went back to texting. I sat there staring at my family, realizing that even my biggest achievement was just another way I'd made their lives easier by requiring nothing from them. That night, lying in my small bedroom surrounded by acceptance letters and scholarship awards I'd earned entirely on my own, I made a decision that would define the rest of my life. When I left for college in a few months, I wouldn't be coming back. Not for holidays, not for summers, not for family emergencies or guilt trips or sudden attempts at reconciliation. I'd spend the next few years building a life that had nothing to do with people who'd made it clear I was an inconvenience they tolerated rather than a daughter they loved. I started planning carefully, quietly. I researched summer jobs near campus, looked into winter break housing options, and made sure all my important documents were in my possession. I wouldn't need their help with anything ever again, which was apparently exactly what they wanted. The realization was both heartbreaking and liberating. Heartbreaking because every child deserves parents who care about their achievements and worry about their future. Liberating because I finally understood that their treatment of me was about them, not me. I wasn't unlovable or worthless, I just had the misfortune of being born to people incapable of loving me properly. Move-in day for college arrived on a sweltering August morning. I'd packed everything I owned into 2 suitcases and a backpack, traveling light by necessity and choice. My parents were nowhere to be found when I came downstairs with my luggage. "Where is everyone?" I asked Smith, who was eating cereal in the kitchen. "Mom and Dad went to my scrimmage," he said without looking up. "They'll be back later." Later. Not in time to drive me to college, not in time to help me move into my dorm, not in time for what most families consider a major milestone. I called a cab with my own money, loaded my few belongings into the trunk, and took one last look at the house where I'd spent 18 years feeling invisible. The taxi driver was kind, helping me with my suitcases and making small talk about starting college. "Your parents must be so proud," he said as we pulled up to the dormitory. "Must be," I replied, tipping him generously with money I'd earned myself. As I watched his car disappear around the corner, I realized I was truly on my own now, and for the first time in my life, that felt like freedom instead of abandonment. My dorm room was tiny, barely enough space for a bed, desk, and dresser, but it was mine. My roommate wouldn't arrive until the next day, so I had a few quiet hours to settle in and process this huge transition. I unpacked my clothes, arranged my few books on the small shelf, and set up the desk where I'd be studying for the next 4 years. On the windowsill, I placed the only photo I'd brought from home, not a family picture, but a photo Mrs. Drake had taken of me receiving an academic award in 8th grade. She'd given it to me after the ceremony, knowing my parents hadn't bothered to attend. That photo represented the beginning of my understanding that I had worth, even if my family couldn't see it. As I looked around my small but peaceful room, I felt something I'd never experienced before, a sense of belonging. This space was mine because I'd earned it. No one could take it away, ignore me here, or make me feel like an inconvenience. For the first time in my life, I was somewhere I truly wanted to be, surrounded by people who were there because they'd chosen to be, not because they were stuck with me. College was a revelation. Within weeks, I'd made friends who actually listened when I talked, remembered my birthday, and invited me to study groups and weekend activities. My roommate Kate became the sister I'd always wanted, someone who celebrated my successes and supported me through difficult classes. When my 19th birthday came around, I mentioned it casually to my new friend group, not expecting much. I'd learned not to get my hopes up about birthdays. But that evening, Kate and 5 other friends showed up at my door with a homemade cake, balloons, and small gifts they'd pooled their money to buy. "Happy birthday," they shouted, crowding into my tiny room with genuine excitement and joy. I started crying right there in front of everyone, overwhelmed by the simple experience of being celebrated. "These are happy tears," I assured them through my sobs, and they understood without explanation. That night, as we ate cake and laughed until our sides hurt, I realized this was what family was supposed to feel like. Not the family you're born into, but the family you choose and who chooses you back. These friends cared about my happiness simply because they wanted to, not because they had to. For years later, I graduated summa cum laude with a double major in English and psychology. As I walked across the stage to receive my diploma, the loudest cheers came from the section where Kate and my college friends were sitting. They'd made a banner with my name and screamed like I'd just won an Olympic medal. I scanned the audience quickly, part of me still hoping despite everything that my parents might have surprised me by showing up. They hadn't, of course. They probably didn't even remember what weekend graduation was, if they knew I was graduating at all. But the disappointment was smaller now, overshadowed by the love and pride radiating from the people who'd chosen to be my family. After the ceremony, my friends took me out to dinner at a fancy restaurant, toasting my achievements and future plans. "To the smartest, strongest person we know," Kate said, raising her glass. "To someone who created her own success and never gave up." They saw me as someone worth celebrating, someone whose accomplishments mattered, someone whose future was bright with possibility. The girl who'd been left alone in a hospital bed at 13 had grown into a woman surrounded by people who truly loved her. 2 years after graduation, I'd built a life that exceeded my wildest childhood dreams. I had a job I loved at a nonprofit organization, an apartment I'd furnished myself, and friendships that felt like the family I'd always wanted. I rarely thought about my parents anymore. They'd become like characters from a sad story I'd once read rather than real people who'd shaped my life. I'd changed my phone number, moved across the country, and built a life they knew nothing about. Then one Tuesday evening, my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize but somehow looked familiar. Against my better judgment, I answered. "Hello?" "Oh, thank God," Mom's voice came through the speaker, sounding older and more strained than I remembered. "I've been trying to find you for months. We need to talk." The sound of her voice sent me right back to being 13 and desperate for her attention, but I forced myself to stay calm. "What do you want?" I asked coolly. "It's your father," she said, her voice shaking slightly. "The business is failing, and we're about to lose the house. Smith can't help, he's struggling with his own bills. We need you to come home and help us figure this out." I sat in my peaceful apartment, looking around at the life I'd built entirely through my own efforts, and felt a strange sense of calm. "You need me," I repeated slowly, tasting the irony of those words. For 18 years, they'd made it clear that I was the child they didn't need, the one who could figure things out on her own, the one whose problems weren't worth their time. Now, suddenly, I was needed. "We're family," Mom continued desperately. "Despite our differences, you have to help us. We raised you, fed you, gave you a home." The manipulation was so transparent it was almost amusing. They provided the legal minimum of care required to avoid criminal charges, and now they thought that entitled them to my adult success. "Do you remember," I said quietly, "when I was 13 and you left me alone at the hospital after my appendix surgery?" There was silence on the other end. "That was different," she finally stammered. "That was years ago. You were fine. I was a scared child who needed her parents," I continued, "and you abandoned me for Smith's soccer game. You told me you had more important things to do than stay with your daughter after surgery." I stood up and walked to my window, looking out at the city lights of the life I'd created far away from them. "You know what the funny thing is?" I said, my voice steady and calm. "I spent years wondering what was wrong with me, why I wasn't worth staying for, why Smith mattered more than I did. It took me a long time to realize the problem was never me." Mom started to interrupt, but I kept talking. "You left me at the hospital when I was 13 so you could watch Smith's soccer game. You forgot my birthdays while throwing parties for him. You saved college money for him while telling me to figure it out myself. You made it clear for 18 years that I didn't matter to your family." My voice grew stronger with each word. Well, congratulations. You succeeded. I'm not part of your family anymore, and your problems aren't my problems. You can't mean that, she whispered, finally understanding that this wasn't just anger that would blow over. I do mean it, I said firmly. You taught me that family is conditional, that love has to be earned, that some children matter more than others. So I found my own family, people who actually care about me. I smiled as I looked around my apartment, thinking about Kate and my other friends who'd become my chosen family. Goodbye, Mom. I hope you figure it out. I hung up the phone and immediately blocked the number. The girl they'd abandoned in that hospital bed had grown up and finally abandoned them back. And for the first time in my life, I was completely, perfectly free. If this story of resilience and finding your chosen family resonated with you, please subscribe for more inspiring tales of people who overcame childhood neglect to build beautiful lives. Share this with anyone who needs a reminder that you can break free from toxic family patterns and create the love you deserve. Your support helps us tell more stories of triumph over adversity and the incredible power of refusing to let others define your worth. Thanks for watching.